Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are viewing this and whenever you're viewing this. My name's Aaron. This is yet another IEEE meeting. Uh, with us today is Jono Poltrack and Tom Crichton of the ADL initiative, Advanced Distributed Learning. Um, ADL is an initiative out of the U.S. Department of Defense. They are my former employers, and they are the organization responsible for bringing the Experience API as an open specification that we're now bringing into IEEE for standardization. Um, since January, there's been a whole lot of interesting research and development work, and John is going to talk to us about at least one of the projects that they've been working on. So, John, what have you been working on?
Well, thanks, Aaron. We've got a lot of different projects actually, and the thing that we're going to talk about today is a proof of concept. And if you bear with me 1 second, I'm going to flip to a slide deck here. I have a few slides, but we're also going to do a live demo. I have Tom Creighton here with me, and he's going to walk through a system that he built. So I know there's a little delay, so I'll give it 1 second just to make sure that those slides pop up for you. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the slide deck now, but I'm sure it'll catch up in a few seconds if not. So what we are going to talk about today is our competency demo, actually known internally as Tom's demo, affectionately known as Tom's demo. And what is this thing? So of course we are the folks that created the shareable content object reference model SCORM, not in isolation with other groups, but it came out of ADL. And that technology has been around for quite some time. It serves its purpose. However, the internet and the learning, training, and performance support world has changed significantly. So now we're looking at new technologies, not building on top of SCORM, considering where SCORM is now, but moving forward on other technologies to support things like, native mobile apps don't fit well into a SCORM environment. A full-scale simulator or some of these augmented reality glasses, they don't fit right into a SCORM environment. So we're working on different technologies that you could think of as a next generation of SCORM, but it's really not a one-to-one mapping, so I think that causes more confusion calling it the next generation of SCORM. And the way we do this work and the way we've done things at ADL for quite some time is, we get requirements from the community, and that's the community at large. Even though the DoD is our primary stakeholder, the DoD purchases system and software and authoring tools and content from industry. So it's important that when we look at requirements, we look more at not just DoD and federal government requirements, but really industry and academia and global learning and training requirements. So out of that requirements, we come up with some harebrained ideas inside of ADL. We look at existing technologies, and we determine if there are gaps, and we do proofs of concept. And often the community never sees these things, because often we learn a little piece and we just kind of move on, or it doesn't work the way we anticipated, and it just goes away. Now, what we're going to see today, Tom's demo, or the competency demo, is one of these proofs of concept. However, in this case, it's working, and it's actually working pretty well, and it's actually has the potential to be pretty large in scope and inform many of the future projects that will be coming out of ADL. So we're just starting now. In fact, this is one of the very first sessions that we've talked about it, and we're continuing to develop it. But anyway, you see I have the little green lit up circle there. What we're going to see today is that proof of concept. We're going to continue to demonstrate and refine it. As we get further and we learn how all of these different things work together. And what these things are, I'll talk about in a minute. But as we learn how these things work together, we'll start to document that. That may look like a spec, that may look like best practices, that may look like software, or a combination of all of the above. And then ultimately, sooner than later, this goes to the public. And it's out there, it's on our GitHub open source platform, and people can take it and beat it up and come back with comments. and hopefully out of it we get some good technology that the community at large can use. Okay, so now let's talk about what it is. What is Tom's demo, or what is this competency demo? A little bit of history on how it started. So I learned the hard way many years ago, maybe 10 or so years ago, that around December is a really bad time to schedule very heavy, tight deadlines for obvious reasons. And I had a miserable December one year because of such deadlines. So, when I have the flexibility to avoid deadlines in December, I do that. So November, December of last year, Tom Creighton, who we'll talk here in a little bit, and his partner in crime, Lou Wolford, who work on the Experience API LRS that we have at ADL, our open source LRS, they came and said, we're about done with this iteration, and do we want to move on and do some other things with the LRS, or what's the priority? And we had a quick chat about whether it should be more LRS tasking or whether we should do something else. And the thought in the November-December timeframe was we really want to move forward taking the Experience API to the next level by incorporating it with other technologies that are out there, like competency specifications, things like registries and repositories, and how could we use all of these things together. So what we decided to do was answer a question. And I'm going to go back to the slides here. And the first question that we set out to answer was, can you use Experience API statements to, quote unquote, satisfy a competency? So what's a competency? There are many efforts out there right now. I'm sure you've heard of Common Core in the CEDS format. Medbiquitous has an ANSI specification for competencies and competency networks. We went with the Medbiquitous at first, but the idea was we've got this Experience API, we're tracking things, and can we complete, satisfy, you insert your own word, can we associate Experience API data with a competency? And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and he's going to show you the answer to this question. So if I can get to, there we go. In a second, your screen will switch over to a web page. Tom?
Okay, so like Jono said, the first attempt was just, can we satisfy it, and can we identify that somewhere in the Experience API so that we know that the statement has or identifies the success of a competency. So we created a basic programming kind of competency, since it was pretty straightforward for programmers to come up with that. And it basically just walks through, so this is using Medbiquitous's format. We just parse the XML that Medbiquitous describes and put it into a more visual format. The green are the ones that we have successfully achieved or mastered or satisfied earlier. And so what we do is we just pull this in, display it to the user. The user can click on one of the competencies, and it provides some sort of content, some tests, some evaluation. We go through it, hopefully successfully. For loop continues. Are there more items? Let's go with true. I'm going to try to do it without looking at the cheat sheet, but I might fail. So let's go for this. Python, the break statement enters the else block before exiting. False. Is false. What is the statement that causes execution to leave? Is that break?
Probably break. Yeah.
Whoa. Let's go with break. Continue in for loop causes false. Python requires brackets around false, I think. Let's try that. What does it say? Does it say I passed? Progress has been reported. You passed the competency. I am successful. So at this point, this system evaluated it, claims I'm successful, and then reports a statement to the LRS that says I have successfully passed it, and it includes the URI to the competency. So Ubiquitous's format says that a competency is identified by a URI. That fits nicely with Experience API because we use URIs for our objects and the context activities and things like that. So we can now use the Experience API statements and their natural identifier to identify something also naturally, such as a ubiquitous competency. So I can go back and I can look in here. Hopefully we used your name. Yes, so in the experience or the LRS, you can see that there's a statement that says Jono has passed the for loop quiz. Oh, I got one wrong. And it says like what my score was. And then down here, we map it. What is it? Control.
Yeah, hit control and use the wheel.
So down under context activities, we use the basic programming. So the ID of the main competency set, the whole list, and then also the specific competency itself. So then this system can search for that, search the LRS for activities that have that competency URI. And when we go back to basic programming, I ask it to update, and it now shows that the for loops have been completed.
Good job, Tom.
Okay, Tom. So what you saw there, I mean, it's in some ways you have to look past the interface because all of this information is dynamic. The table of contents you're seeing on the screen is being pulled from a ubiquitous competency network. There's no local database that's saying these things are passed. This is an evaluation of Experience API statements in an external LRS. So it's really a system of services that's providing this information. So that was phase one, and I'm going to go back to the presentation here just briefly. That was phase one, and what we did find is that yes, you can satisfy, quote unquote, a competency with Experience API statements, in this case a ubiquitous competency. But there's some buts. Number one but is that, as Tom showed you, the competency identifier is hard-coded in the Experience API statement. So why is that a caveat? Well, your content developers are most likely not going to know that competency ID ahead of time. You know, they're creating content for Python programming, and they may not be aware that that piece of content is going to fit into a competency network or be associated with a competency network. Further than that, nothing says that there is one competency network to rule them all. Harvard, MIT, and Stanford could all have different competency networks for Intro to Python and could all point at different content. So in that case, you could have a series of IDs that this content would need to know about. And knowing about that ahead of time is, it's a difficult assumption. It's probably not going to work that way when you scale this. The second caveat is that you noticed when Tom clicked on that table of contents that it launched into a quiz. Well, where'd that quiz come from? So the content that is associated with the competency in this first phase of the demonstration was hard-coded. So in other words, we knew that the ubiquitous competency structure that we created for Python had a for loops module, and we created an assessment that went along with that to test it, and we hard-coded that when you clicked on that darn competency, you got that quiz. Again, not scalable. So we go to question 2. And actually this was great because, I mentioned December, Tom and Lou came back after about a week and said, yep, here it is, it works. And we looked at it in detail and we said, all right, let's add a second question to this. The second question is related to one of the caveats in the last slide. So can content that supports a competency be identified dynamically? So in other words, don't hard code that relationship between for loops and the quiz that you got. Can we use an external system to actually search for content that's associated with that competency and dynamically find it and launch it for the user? What you're going to see here in the next demonstration component, it looks very similar to what you saw the last time, except it's going to use our Learning Registry. If you're not familiar with the Federal Learning Registry project, it's a joint effort between the DoD and Department of Education. If you're not familiar with registries at all, I like to use an analogy of Google. Google does not contain all of the websites in the world. However, you can go onto Google and search and be redirected because it's an index of all of the websites and information that are out there. And a registry is similar. It does not contain the content, but it allows you to search based on metadata and paradata, which is usage data, things like likes or how the content is being used in a classroom. You can search on that information and then be redirected to where the content actually resides. So in phase 2, we're going to go ahead and demonstrate answering that second question. Can we do the same thing that we did in phase 1, except not hard code the content? Can we dynamically find the content that's associated with the competency? And we're going to go back to Tom.
Okay, so to try to meet that second challenge, what we did is we went onto our YouTube site and found a content series by Peter Birking that was describing how to choose an LMS. So it was a list of videos on how to pick and how to decide what LMS you would like to use for your organization. So we had existing content, and what we did, Lou did, is he registered that content in the Learning Registry and associated it to competencies that we had created. So now you have within the Learning Registry, you have the content and the competency tied together. And by doing that, we had the ability of, again, giving you this menu, but instead of having to hard code the URL to the video and make those decisions beforehand, we could just ask the Learning Registry for any content that was associated with the competency in question. So whenever we click on choosing an LMS Part 3, behind the scenes, this system actually goes out to the Learning Registry, asks the Learning Registry if there's any content that is associated or has the key or the ID of the competency URI. So when you click it, the results come back. This is parsed from the Learning Registry and gives us a link to our content that was in the Learning Registry. You can click that and watch the video. We use the actor's name and the LMS configuration that has been set up. You can watch the video. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the idea is you launch the video, it tracks to the Learning Record Store, and tracks things like when you started it, when you paused it, when you resume it, when you get at certain locations through the video, it will say that I got so far, and then whenever you complete it, it says that you completed it. So after doing that, if I actually completed it, I could come back to my competencies, go to the choosing an LMS update, and it would update accordingly. As you can see, I did watch Part 5, and it has updated previously.
Great, thanks, Tom. So in that part of the demo, what did we find? So we found that we could address one of the caveats from Part 1. So in other words, we don't want to hard code content and associate that hard coded content with a competency. We want to find it dynamically, and we did that using a system like the Learning Registry. It doesn't have to be the Learning Registry, but the Learning Registry is something that we've worked on here at ADL, and the Paradata actually seemed like a really good way that if people put content, register content in the Learning Registry, after the fact, different schools or instructors or administrators can associate that content with their competency networks, or they can decide to trust somebody else's competency network. Maybe I just decide I know XYZ instructor at Stanford. He's already gone through and associated competencies with content out of the Learning Registry. I'll just trust what he did and use his. So that all becomes a possibility. But we have another caveat in this section. Just like in the first phase of this demonstration, Those YouTube videos, when they track Experience API statements, they still have the competency ID as part of the statement. So you still have to know that ahead of time. So even though we found the content dynamically, we're still relying on the content to know about the competency it's associated with. So that's still something that's going to cause this not to be scalable. So actually, let me back up 1 second. And it's something we kind of glossed over that I think is really neat and important, sort of outside the scope of the core of this demo, but YouTube videos don't track Experience API. They're just YouTube videos, but our video is tracking. So how does that work? We're looking at what we call around here an ADL player. So we have a Experience API enabled player for YouTube videos. It knows about YouTube videos. It knows about the events that YouTube videos publish, like pause, start, when it completes, when it hits certain time codes, and we're able to track on behalf of the video. Since we know it was a YouTube video that was launched, we decide to track on behalf of the video, even though the video is not smart and does not track on its own. So anyway, I think that's pretty neat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so going into the final phase of, well, we're a little further than this, but the final phase for the purposes of this presentation, the third and final question. Okay, so now we've shown that you can satisfy a competency with Experience API statements. We found that when you select a competency that you can dynamically find content that's associated with it and launch it to the user. But we still have that problem that the Experience API statements have to be hard-coded to know about the competency. So can we set it up so that Experience API enabled content can track, and later that data can be associated with a competency, and maybe not just to satisfy it. Maybe you satisfy it as a novice, or you become an expert, or you get a certain type of badge. So how complicated can we get with associating Experience API statements to different levels of a competency? And again, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tom for the final component of the live demo.
Okay, so to try to figure this out, we started with examples that we had from way back at the BAA. We were given examples on how to use the Experience API, and one of those was the Tetris example. And in that, you actually get to play Tetris, and as you play, your progress and your success is reported to an LRS. And the cool thing about it is it has more information than just, you know, passed or failed. You actually get to know things like how many lines you got, what your score was. So there's a little bit more data around it. So let's say you look at this one. Down in the extensions, you have things like the levels, the lines, how long you played, and as well as the result of the score. So there's more information there, and you can kind of get the idea of if you could do levels, if you could do you know, somebody's ability more than just I passed or I failed, but I am an expert, or maybe this is my first time playing, so I might have gotten a few lines, but I'm not doing that great. You can give kind of a scale on how well they play Tetris. So we used the performance framework within Ubiquitous that gives you that ability to mark thresholds and you know, performance levels. And we identified in there what activities in the Experience API concept of objects and activities, what activities would satisfy this performance, or you know, at least lend to this performance evaluation. So now people who have already played Tetris and the developers who had no idea that we were going to come back later and try to associate this with competencies, those statements, that information that's already in the LRS can you know, feed back to this evaluation, and you can get credit for things that may not have known they were tied to a competency beforehand. So assuming that I played Tetris, which in this case Jono did, so he has some scores in there, I can click the My Tetris badges, and this will go and grab the performance information, find out what the thresholds are for success, then go out and ask the LRS for any statements that Jono has for Tetris, evaluate them, and give you badges accordingly. Click the button, up pops stuff. So he's doing pretty good. He's got 5 of the 22 badges. And this is evaluated real time. Whenever I clicked the button, it actually went out to the LRS, got the statements, and then did the evaluation to see whether he met these or not.
I think that may have been my best day at ADL when I had to sit down and play Tetris for about an hour to get some of these badges. It was awesome. So, okay, going back to the presentation. Great. So, what did we find? So we found in this case that you could satisfy a competency with experience API statements without knowing about that competency ahead of time. Somebody just created experience API content, it tracks. They didn't know that it was going to be part of a competency network, or in the case of like a YouTube video, it never even knew it was going to be tracked ever. And now that data can actually be used to show that you've, maybe it's not that you've satisfied a competency, but you could just show that many of my students are accessing a specific YouTube video. Maybe that's a good informal resource that I should start sending other people to because it's helping them. A second thing is that you're not just limited to turn this thing green or turn this thing red. You can create custom combinations of those experience API statements with extensions to satisfy, again, quote unquote. I know I'll get beat up on some of these words. Satisfy a competency. I don't mean satisfy a competency. What I really mean is that you can associate data with a competency in different ways, and that can be to give badges. That could be to say you're an expert. That could be a lot of different things, and it's really up to the administrators or the instructors on how this content relates to their competency. It doesn't have to be one rule for the entire world. You can actually customize that per your installation, per your environment, or you can trust somebody else's assertion, which is also pretty neat. So just like in the other slides where we have what did we find, we have the caveats. And in this one, there's still a lot to do. So I've got a couple slides to talk about some of the assumptions that were made in the demonstration that you may or may not have noticed. So first of all, the demonstration assumes that when it dynamically found content from the learning registry, that it was a web-based piece of content and that I could launch it and it didn't require additional security and there was no cost or license for it. And again, in the real world, we know that those are faulty assumptions. Systems are more complicated than that. Repositories of content have logins and security models and e-commerce models. So, we know that launch is more complicated than just here's a link from the registry. So that's something that is an assumption in the demonstration. And honestly, we could look at something that exists like LTI or several other technologies out there to see if we could come up with a little bit more complex launch to handle the different types of launch that may be available. For example, how do you launch a brick and mortar course? What do you see? Well, you might see a landing page that gives you a schedule of the course and a contact or a registration page. So, launch for something like that is very different than launch of an e-learning course that's going to track, which is very different than launch of a thick client game that is on your computer. And all of these things really need to be accounted for because all of those different types of content are used. Also, the demo assumes that the content tracks via the Experience API, and that's not entirely true when you get to the YouTube video case, but that lends itself to the idea of this player notion. So when you search for content, if you're able to identify by the metadata or paradata or other information what type of content it is, you may be able to do some tracking on its behalf. So for example, if it's a Experience API enabled content, well, you just let it do its thing. If it's a YouTube video, well, then you catch those HTML5 events that it publishes and you track on its behalf. If it's something that doesn't publish events, maybe all you can do is track that it was accessed. And that's something. That at a minimum your learner clicked on the link and launched it, or that they looked at a landing page, or whatever information you have, depending on the type of content. you can get some amount of information, in some places a lot of information, in other places minimal information, but you can track information to see how your learners are using this content. So those are some assumptions that we are aware of, and actually there's more, but these are some of the big assumptions in the demonstration. So some of the features that we're looking at, again, proof of concept, we're just looking at how this stuff works and how far can we take it. I mentioned the advanced content launch. I mentioned LTI, which is something worth looking into for that. But how do we know, quote unquote, know about what type of content it is and what device it works on and what other requirements are part of that launch process. Content players. So we did it for YouTube and that worked great. What if I have SCOs? SCOs think that there's an LMS in the mix. What if I'm launching it outside of an LMS? Can I trick a SCO into thinking it's running in an LMS, but then track experience API statements behind the scenes without it really knowing? What about a simulation? And what does a player for a simulation look like, and what requirements does that have? So we learned a lot just doing the YouTube videos. So we'd like to try some other players for content that may not natively track experience API statements. What can we do on behalf of the content? Next, the learner profile. So our learner profile in this system is what lines are green, or what badges do you have. Further than that, that is compiled every time from the LRS. So Tom clicks that refresh or update button, and it hits the LRS, and it pulls in a local copy, and you see what's green, and then all that information goes away. But what other information? Well, number one, should we have a local data store of that compiled information that is a rolled up learner profile information? Beyond that, what other things about a learner would be valuable in a learner profile? And I mean, there's of course a lot of things that you can do with a learner profile. The aspect that personally I'm most interested in is, once we know things about Tom and the way as he is interacting with the system, can we look at trends in the Experience API data of people who are like Tom, and then provide custom recommendations based on that? So you know that Tom is an English speaker, that Tom lives in Alexandria, Virginia, that Tom is a certain age or has a certain degree, and could you find other people like Tom and find trends in their data that you use to recommend to other people like Tom who may be having trouble? So anyway, that's really leads to the next bullet, a recommender engine. So in our demonstration, Tom clicked on a link, and it is associated with one piece of content in the registry. What if it's associated with 600 pieces of content in the registry? Do you give somebody a list of 600 things to pick from, or do you launch the one thing that's most appropriate for them? I think what we'll end up doing as a proof of concept is we will try through some sort of minimal intelligence to determine the most appropriate thing to launch. However, just like something like Pandora, if you're familiar with Pandora, the music service, you can click on a link that says, why did you select this for me? And you can kind of see the reason why it selected a song for you. So it'd be nice to have it launch one piece of content, even if there are 500 pieces of content that are associated with it. But you could click the give me more details, and you could see the next 10 things that it considered launching and information on why it selected it for you. So a lot of interesting things that you can do with a recommender engine. And then administrator or instructor features. So import a competency network. That kind of works already, but what if I want to go grab Common Core, which is hosted on a Department of Education site? I want to just point at that network, suck it in, and boom, I have all that stuff available right in my system. Next, associate content with competencies. So you saw again when Tom did the demonstration that he clicked on a competency, which is not content, it's just a competency. There was a search done on the Learning Registry, and it pulled back content that was associated with that competency. Well, how did the Learning Registry know that? Well, because we put data in the Learning Registry that said that manually. We associated that. However, you can imagine systems of the future. If I'm an instructor and administrator and I pull in an intro to programming competency network, I'm associating my content with it, my videos and my regular content, and maybe I want to go do some searches on sites like Stack Overflow, which is a site for programmers where they can get information, or YouTube videos that do walkthroughs. I may want to associate that content with my competency. So why would I not be able to do that in the administrative features of my system? What's great about that is when I do that association, my system should push that usage data to the learning registry so that it's available for others. So that when others hit the learning registry, they can see that I associated that YouTube video that's available via that paradata in the learning registry. And it's a bit complicated. We probably should have some pictures that show these things. And then the final thing, import others' content associations. So, you know, I mentioned maybe I trust a professor at Stanford and all of these, his competency network. I like that for intro to Python programming. His content that he chose for, you know, extracurricular or informal performance support, whatever he associated, maybe I trust him and I just want to pull in his associations. That's another thing that you can do and really save some time. So these are all proofs of concept that are coming up, and to be perfectly honest with you, some of these are already at some level of completion, just not ready to demo today in this session. So finally, if you go way back to the beginning of this presentation, we kind of had the arrow with, you know, what is this and how do projects work at ADL. We're showing you this demonstration and this proof of concept probably earlier than we would have in the past because we want to start talking about these different ideas. But what we really want to do is start to, like we did with the Experience API, is start to get the community involved. There are a lot of different projects, you know, content brokering and recommenders, this complex launch of content, again, players for all different types of content, paradata in the learning registry and using that paradata for competencies, just competency network best practices. You know, we've used Medbiquitous, but Tom has proven that as long as a competency is associated or identified by a URI, it doesn't matter what structure it is, Medbiquitous or the CEDS Common Core or the InLoc, it doesn't matter as long as a URI is involved. So can we support many competency networks, and what are the best practices in order to be able to use it with the Experience API and the performance framework? And then a more complex learner profile that will assist you with recommendations. Each one of those could be as big as or even bigger than the Experience API project, and you know, it's something that we will need community involvement and help and requirements and in fact priority. You know, what's first, what's second, what's third. That's all really important, and you know, I don't think we're going to make that decision at ADL alone. We're gonna want to hear what the community has to say. So these are some examples, and very soon this information will be available out on our website, and we'll have some videos out there, and all the software will be available, and we can really start having a detailed conversation about what's next. With that, we've kind of hit the end of our live demo, and we thought that Aaron, you may have some questions, or some other folks may have some chat questions, and we wanted to save some time. So
Cool.
we'll turn it over to you.
Well, so we have the Q&A feature on our Google Hangout on there. So if people want to submit questions, that's totally cool. In the meantime, let me just ask like a couple of low-hanging fruit questions. I mean, so we've talked a lot about this. This maps very well. A lot of these ideas are mapping very closely to the idea of the training and learning architecture, right? I mean, so with that in mind, with all the things that you have modeled, how many of them require changes to the actual spec itself in order to see happen?
So, and you know, I'll maybe ask Tom to weigh in here too. I think this is what is one of the most interesting parts of this demonstration. There was nothing invented for this. I mean, we're using existing technologies, we're using the existing learning registry, we're using the existing Experience API spec. However, the Experience API spec has a lot of flexibility. You can do a lot of things in a lot of different ways. What I think we need is not necessarily changes to the specifications to enable this demo. This demo works. What I think we need is best practices to show there are probably 10 or 15 ways that you could do these things. We've learned a lot in our demonstration here, and through that learning process, we'd like to make a recommendation that we apply, statements for the Experience API in this way, that we use the performance framework to associate Experience API statements to a competency network in this way, that we use the learning registry paradata in this way to represent a competency. And so I don't think we are breaking any of the specifications. We're just applying them in a certain way that requires best practices. Tom, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. I'm going to add my own personal opinion. There are a few pieces that maybe in the process of figuring out the best practices, we could go back to, say, the Experience API or the Learning Registry and say, if you could add one or two pieces, it would make it clearer for a system and simpler for systems to parse that data or find the data that they want. Yeah. But it does work as is. I didn't extend anything. We used what was there so that it wasn't smoke and mirrors and that it was an actual real live demo.
Yeah, a good example is, if we're going to have this, if people are going to start to buy into these competency-based education efforts, and they're going to want to use the competency structures to do things like complex recommendations or intelligent tutoring systems that use that data. It may be worthwhile having a dedicated area in the Experience API statement for competency information that can be queried on. We don't have that. We don't have that exactly right now. We just have the kind of generic context activities, and you could use extensions, but they're not queryable. So I think it depends on interest, though, Aaron. Do we make a sweeping change like that? Is this something that the community at large wants, or is this, an idea that we came up in December with Tom's demo and nobody's really going to do in practice? And I think the community will have to help us determine that.
I agree with that part. I think my question was really more to the point of, in order to even technically do these things, what I'm hearing is nothing about the spec had to change. With that said, down the road, it would be easier if there was a way to recognize like established practice or application of the API to do certain types of things.
Yeah, I've been my internal around ADL recently. I've started coding more than I have in years, and when you get into things and you actually touch it, and you go and you ask Tom, how do you do this, and Tom says, this is the way. However, if you go look at this example, they did it a little different way. What I'm personal opinion here is, this is not necessarily the views of ADL, but personal opinion here is that the rest of this year is the year of best practices, and that's not just for tying Experience API to competencies or using the performance framework with Medbiquitous or other competency specs. I think this is the year where the Experience API and these other specs give you huge amounts of flexibility to do so many more things than you could have done in the past with legacy specifications. But with that flexibility comes a lack of interoperability in some cases. So in some areas, you actually do want things done in a consistent way. This is a bad example, but I'll use it anyway. If people are going to set a score for a piece of content, you want it done in one way, so that if you're building a reporting system and you're pulling, from 10 different LRSs and you used 15 different authoring tools to create the content, you want to know how that score is represented and be able to pull it without doing a lot of logic on, is this thing a score? Again, bad example because that is fairly consistent now. But there are several things out there that are common use cases that are being done in slightly different ways. So I think that we need to get in, and in fact, we're having ADL's having a workshop at our Orlando CoLab here in a few weeks in June, focused on the Experience API, and we have a lot of different sessions. A session on we're building an Android implementation. We're doing web content from scratch. We're doing if you're starting with SCORM content. We're doing if you're a designer or if you're a decision maker who's going to look to spend money and make a decision on a technology investment. And there's even one on reporting and analytics. In this process, we've started to internally come up with our own, we've seen this done in 5 different ways. It would be really nice if a recommendation came out of ADL that said this is the way. Not that that's going to be the right recommendation, but it's a starting point to have a discussion. So through the rest of the year, Aaron, to answer your question, yes, best practices, and more than just best practices for competency networks, best practices across the board. Because you mentioned the TLA, and you look at the TLA and you look at what's out on the ADL site, and it looks like the Experience API is very mature. There's some stuff in content brokering that's done as far as systems, and the rest is really in its infancy. But I would assert to you that it's further along than you think. And the reason it's further along than you think is because we're not going to invent some of those components of the TLA. They exist, and people are doing them already. And all we have to do is go out and say, we're not going to create a new competency network. If you're going to use a competency network like Medbiquitous or Inloc, etc., here's the best practices on how you tie it together. So I think these best practices, putting them in place, will really start to bring those other components of the TLA to light as this year goes forward.
I agree. We have a couple questions here. Some of them are. So, what are some of one question that we have is what are some use cases or examples of people using the Experience API in the wild? I'm like, well, and just to draw some attention to that, I mean, there are already now a number of case studies being published out on the web of organizations and how they're using Experience API, both in their tool adoption and in other ways. You're having the workshop at the ADL CoLab in Orlando is going to probably highlight a couple of things that you guys have at least been brought in on. I know that the Connections XAPI events in both Chicago and London are focused mostly on organizations that are adopting and organizations that are interested in adopting and getting those groups to talk to each other about like what it is they're doing, what tools they're using. I would say the design patterns that go into using the API. So I don't want to really belabor that there. Just only to probably address that there are a lot of use cases. There are case studies, that, not even just use cases, but case studies of people who are actually using the API, out in the world.
Yeah. We're seeing more and more, and I know that Aaron, I think you were involved and some others with the survey that went out, and I think some more of that stuff this year is going to be important to get a grasp on. All right, let me take a step back. Well, that survey is going to give a grasp on what's out there and how people are using it and how they intend to use it, and I think that's really important. Now, the problem, and it's not really a problem, but one of the complicated messaging aspects of the Experience API is in that it is so flexible. Unlike a spec like the SCORM, we're going to move web-based content from system to system. You're going to be able to track and run it in an interoperable way. 10 seconds, done, got it. The Experience API doesn't have a 10-second pitch like that because it depends heavily on the audience. Because some people care about that. I want to track a score, and I want to do it outside of my learning management system. No problem. Learning analytics. I want to collect data about my learners and see if my content is good. No problem. I've got a full-scale simulator. It's always been separate. I have to go in and manually enter data. I want to pull that data, come up with a score, and put it into my system. Experience API will do that. So anyway, there are so many different aspects of the Experience API out there that, number one, it's hard to just go, here's that use case, which is why looking at the community and everything that's happening out there, because we could come up with our list of 20 things, but the community does 50 others that we never thought of. So I think looking at the community and seeing what they're doing is important. Second, every time I talk to somebody who's doing a pilot project or starting a real implementation, they tell me it would be great to have a registry or a adopter list, and I know there's a few out there, but something more comprehensive, because every time I turn the corner, I bump into Joe right down the road who's doing the same thing, and we wish we could have communicated ahead of time. So I think that's something that we at ADL and you, Aaron, and others in the community, we really need to pull together and start to bring in the implementations and pilot projects and adopter list together, so that there is a more comprehensive list of what's being done and who is doing it and what the problems are and what's working well. So hopefully we can do that this year also.
Yep. All right. I'm going to wrap up our call. Thank you, Jono. Thank you, Tom, if you're still there.
He's here.
Yep.
Yes.
I was waiting actually to see Tom's face and the eyes move. Anyway, hi, Tom. Just a reminder that the State of the Experience API tool survey is wrapping up this week on May 31st. Those results will be released in their raw form. I'll share that Google document link, as well as I'll post those results in the CSV file on GitHub. And then coming in the next month will be an actual report that I'll put on GitHub as well, in a markdown document that people can poke holes at, look to add things, etc. Which will be a collaboratively authored document. As well, that we'll be drafting the PAR very shortly and putting that out for review. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of surprises. I think what we're coming to is, and this is after hearing many of these stories over the last couple of months on calls like this and interviews like this. I don't think that we're going to have really call for any major functional change in the specification itself as it goes into IEEE standardization, save possibly for some instruction on how we write companion documents or extensions to the API, so that we can actually have an official means of understanding if we're going to work with competency networks, here's a way in which we should all be doing it. If we're going to be working with Mozilla badges, here's how we do that. If we're going to work with SCORM content, here's the way that we do that. And those would be companion. In my head, and I think it makes sense from Jono, from your standpoint as well, it makes sense to have those as companion documents or extensions to the actual specification, the standard, not necessarily core.
Right, and it makes sense that if you look for an extension for, I don't know, pulling out of thin air, healthcare applications, and you go and you need an extension for some sort of simulations, that there would be a similar document set with similar information, so that we could provide some guidance that regardless of how you're extending, that there's a common set of information per extension, and I think that would be really helpful to bring the community together.
Mm-hmm. All right. With that, we're going to sign off. Thank you very much. Just so everybody else knows, we will be scheduling another interview sometime in the near future, probably in the next 2 weeks. The Connections X API registration is open. That the low prices for the first wave end June 15th, so register now. ADL has a workshop, a 2-day workshop on June 18th and 19th. Is that right?
I believe it's that week. Don't quote me on the dates. If you go to ADL.net.gov, soon there will be, if it's not there, there'll be information shortly on ADL.net.gov about it. But yeah, it's a 2-day workshop, and then there's 1 day before that that's focused on really just presenting to people who are beginners. But a lot of interactive stuff if you're interested. So ADL.net.gov, check it out over the next few days.
All right, and that's all. Thank you very much, Jono. Take care.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having Tom and I. See you, everybody.